In the spring of 1941, the appearance of Battleship Bismarck altered the balance of naval power in the Atlantic. At more than 50,000 tons at full load, she represented the most ambitious expression of German surface fleet design to date. Her scale, armor, and firepower embodied a strategic belief that a single capital ship properly employed could disrupt an empire that depended on sea lanes for survival. Yet the story of Bismarck is not defined solely by steel and specifications. It is shaped by the environment in which she operated an ocean that functioned as both battlefield and barrier theater, where visibility, weather intelligence, and timing often mattered as much as guns. In this setting, every movement was observed, interpreted, and contested by opposing fleets, whose decisions unfolded across thousands of miles of open water. Today, the Atlantic conceals the final traces of that encounter. Far below the surface lies a silent record of design choices, operational pressures, and human judgment. The question is not merely where the ship rests, but what remains legible in that submerged evidence. What can be understood about a vessel conceived for one kind of war, yet tested in another? And how does a single voyage illuminate the realities of naval conflict at the midpoint of the Second World War? To answer these questions, we must begin before the chase itself, by understanding why Bismarck existed at all and what her presence signified in 1941. By the late 1930s, Germany's naval leadership faced a strategic dilemma shaped by geography and industrial reality. Unlike Britain, whose security and economy depended on global maritime trade, Germany entered the Second World War with limited access to open oceans and a surface fleet that remained numerically inferior. The mission assigned to the Kriegsmarine was therefore not to command the seas outright, but to challenge British control selectively, imposing disproportionate strain on shipping routes and naval resources. German naval doctrine emphasized disruption rather than dominance. Commerce warfare conducted by submarines and supplemented by surface raiders aimed to force the Royal Navy to disperse its forces across vast distances. Within this framework, capital ships were intended as instruments of strategic pressure. Their mere presence in the Atlantic could compel Britain to allocate battleships, cruisers, and aircraft to tracking and containment, reducing flexibility elsewhere. Bismarck was conceived within this logic. Her design reflected an effort to produce a surface combatant capable of independent operations, with the endurance to operate far from German ports and the resilience to survive encounters with enemy-heavy units. She was not intended to fight decisive fleet actions in confined waters, but to exploit the open Atlantic as a maneuver space where intelligence gaps and weather could complicate enemy responses. This approach carried inherent risks. Germany lacked a global network of bases, forward repair facilities, and air cover. Surface ships operating beyond the reach of friendly ports depended on precise coordination, favorable timing, and limited exposure. Once detected, their operational freedom narrowed rapidly. The strategic value of a ship like Bismarck therefore rested on a narrow margin between success and isolation. In 1941, these tensions were already evident. The Atlantic had become a contested environment shaped by evolving detection technologies, coordinated convoy systems, and hard-earned British experience in countering raiders. Bismarck entered this space not as a symbol of assured dominance, but as a calculated gamble, one that sought to leverage strength and uncertainty against an adversary whose greatest advantage lay in control of information and logistics. Understanding this strategic context is essential before examining the ship herself and the engineering choices that shaped her capabilities and limitations. The design of Bismarck reflected a transitional moment in naval engineering when battleships were still conceived as decisive instruments of sea power, yet increasingly constrained by air reconnaissance, long-range communications, and evolving weapon systems. German naval architects sought to balance protection, firepower, and endurance within the limits imposed by available shipyards and materials. Her hull form emphasized stability in heavy seas, a necessity for sustained Atlantic operations. A broad beam and deep draft contributed to a steady gun platform, while internal subdivision was intended to improve survivability against underwater damage. Armor protection followed a traditional philosophy, a thick vertical belt to shield vital machinery, and magazines paired with armored decks, designed to defeat plunging fire at long range. This approach favored close to medium-range engagements, reflecting assumptions about how battleships would encounter one another. Main armament consisted of 8 38-centimeter guns mounted in 4 twin turrets, arranged in 2 super-firing pairs fore and aft. These weapons offered high muzzle velocity and accuracy, but they also imposed significant weight and space requirements. Secondary batteries were arranged to counter cruisers and destroyers, while anti-aircraft defenses, though present, reflected the pre-war underestimation of air power's growing role. Propulsion systems were engineered for a balance between speed and range rather than maximum output. High-pressure steam turbines provided sufficient velocity to outrun many adversaries, while fuel capacity supported extended operations without immediate resupply. However, this emphasis on endurance increased displacement and mechanical complexity, creating maintenance demands that were difficult to meet far from friendly ports. From an engineering perspective, Bismarck was neither obsolete nor revolutionary. She represented a mature expression of interwar battleship design optimized for survivability and sustained surface action. At the same time, her layout revealed the limits of that paradigm. Heavy armor could not fully compensate for exposure to air attack or prolonged pursuit, and reliance on traditional gunnery assumed conditions that wartime realities increasingly denied. These design choices shaped not only what Bismarck could do, but how she would be employed. To understand their practical consequences, it is necessary to examine how the ship's capabilities translated into real operations once she entered active service. Bismarck's operational career was brief yet densely concentrated within a critical phase of the Atlantic War. Commissioned into service in August 1940, the ship spent months in trials and training, refining crew coordination and systems reliability under controlled conditions. These preparatory activities were essential, as the effectiveness of a capital ship depended as much on procedural discipline as on hardware. In May 1941, Bismarck embarked on her first combat deployment as part of an operation intended to enter the Atlantic and threaten Allied shipping. Accompanied by the heavy cruiser Prince Eugen, the mission sought to exploit gaps in British reconnaissance and capitalize on the vastness of the ocean. The objective was not immediate confrontation, but sustained pressure on maritime traffic, forcing the Royal Navy to divert resources to tracking and interception. Detection, however, occurred earlier than planned. Once sighted, Bismarck's movements became the focus of a coordinated response involving surface units, air patrols, and intelligence analysis. Engagements that followed demonstrated both the ship's strengths and the constraints imposed by operating under constant surveillance. Gunnery exchanges revealed the effectiveness of her main battery, yet each encounter also increased the likelihood of cumulative damage and mechanical strain. As the pursuit continued, operational freedom narrowed. Decisions were shaped by fuel considerations, weather conditions, and the need to manage emerging vulnerabilities. Coordination with accompanying units became increasingly difficult as circumstances evolved, highlighting the challenges of executing long-range surface operations without assured support. Throughout this period, Bismarck functioned less as an isolated weapon and more as a moving node within a wider system of naval warfare. Her presence triggered reactions across the British fleet, from convoy rerouting to the concentration of capital ships. The episode illustrated how a single vessel, even without achieving its primary objectives, could influence strategic behavior through the demands it imposed on an adversary. These operational realities set the conditions for the final phase of Bismarck's voyage, where accumulated pressures converged and the limits of endurance coordination and control became decisive. The concluding phase of Bismarck's voyage unfolded as a convergence of accumulated damage, strategic isolation, and sustained pressure from opposing forces. After days of pursuit, the ship's ability to maneuver freely had been steadily reduced. Mechanical limitations and earlier impacts constrained speed, and steering options narrowing the range of viable decisions available to her commanders. By the morning of 27th of May 1941, the battleship faced concentrated opposition in open waters. British surface units closed the distance under conditions shaped by weather visibility and prior intelligence assessments. What followed was not a sudden collapse, but a gradual neutralization of combat effectiveness. Main batteries were increasingly impaired, secondary systems were disrupted, and internal conditions deteriorated as damage compounded over time. Throughout the engagement, actions on both sides reflected established naval doctrine rather than improvisation. British forces emphasized sustained fire and positional advantage, seeking to eliminate the ship's remaining offensive capability. German responses focused on maintaining cohesion and preserving command functions for as long as possible. The exchange was defined less by dramatic maneuver and more by the methodical application of force within the constraints imposed by the situation. As structural integrity declined, the outcome became increasingly certain. The ship's designers had anticipated heavy punishment, and her internal subdivision delayed immediate loss. Yet endurance could not alter strategic reality. Cut off from support and unable to disengage, Bismarck reached the limits of what engineering and discipline could achieve under sustained attack. The final loss of the vessel marked the end of her operational existence, but not the end of her historical significance. The moment represented a broader shift in naval warfare, illustrating how detection, coordination, and persistence could overcome even the most formidable surface combatants. It underscored the diminishing space for independent capital ship operations in an environment dominated by combined arms and information superiority. With the voyage concluded, the focus shifts from action to aftermath, from the surface of the Atlantic to the silent evidence resting far below, where the physical remains offer further insight into the events of that final day. In the decades following the loss of the ship, knowledge of her final resting place remained limited to wartime reports and survivor testimony. The Atlantic, vast and deep, preserved the site beyond the reach of conventional observation. When the wreck was eventually located in the late 20th century, it confirmed that the vessel lay at a depth of roughly 4,800 meters, resting upright on the seabed, separated from portions of her superstructure. The condition of the hull offered important clarification. The main body appeared largely intact, while surrounding debris formed a wide field that reflected the forces involved during the ship's final minutes and descent. Damage patterns visible on the structure allowed researchers to compare physical evidence with historical accounts, refining understanding of how the ship was disabled and how she settled on the ocean floor. At such depth, corrosion progresses, slowly preserving overall form while erasing finer surface details. Because direct access is limited, interpretation relies on a combination of photographic surveys, sonar mapping, and archival documentation. These sources are integrated to create visual reconstructions that depict the wreck as it is understood to exist today. Such reconstructions do not attempt to recreate events moment by moment, nor do they imply alteration of the site. Instead, they serve as analytical tools, translating fragmented data into coherent spatial models. Through this process, historians and engineers can assess structural deformation, separation points, and orientation in relation to recorded timelines. The aim is not spectacle, but clarity, to visualize how a complex warship designed for surface combat came to rest in an environment entirely outside its intended purpose. These reconstructions also illustrate the limits of certainty. Gaps remain where data is incomplete, and interpretations are revised as methods improve. The wreck, therefore, is not a fixed narrative conclusion, but an ongoing source of inquiry. It connects documented history with physical reality, grounding written records in material evidence. From this silent record beneath the Atlantic, attention turns to what the ship's brief existence ultimately contributed to naval thought and historical understanding. The historical significance of Battleship Bismarck extends beyond the circumstances of her loss. Her brief operational life has come to represent a turning point in the employment of capital ships, marking the narrowing window in which battleships could operate independently in contested oceans. From a strategic perspective, Bismarck demonstrated both the potential and the limitations of surface raiding by heavy units. Her deployment compelled the diversion of substantial Allied naval resources, illustrating how a single ship could exert influence disproportionate to its numbers. At the same time, the coordinated response she provoked underscored the effectiveness of integrated surveillance communication and multi-unit operations in constraining such threats. Technologically, the ship reflected the maturity of interwar battleship design. Heavy armor, powerful main batteries, and robust internal subdivision were capable of absorbing punishment and sustaining combat effectiveness longer than earlier generations. Yet, these strengths were increasingly offset by vulnerabilities to air attack, long-range detection, and cumulative damage over extended operations. Bismarck's experience highlighted the difficulty of reconciling endurance and protection with the demands of mobility and concealment in modern naval warfare. At the human level, her story emphasizes the role of decision-making under uncertainty. Commanders on all sides operated with incomplete information, adapting plans as conditions evolved. Success and failure alike emerged not from isolated moments, but from sequences of choices shaped by doctrine training and situational awareness. In the broader narrative of the Second World War, Bismarck occupies a space between eras. She belonged to a tradition that valued the battleship as the centerpiece of naval power, yet her fate foreshadowed the ascendancy of aircraft carriers, submarines, and information-driven operations. Her legacy is therefore not one of triumph or defeat alone, but of transition. By examining her design, deployment, and final voyage through historical analysis and visual reconstruction, we gain insight into how navies learned, adapted, and redefined power at sea. The Atlantic preserves the physical trace of that lesson, while history continues to interpret its meaning quietly, carefully, and without finality.